The Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, Eclecs Creative Agency, and WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the home of acclaimed podcast Charlotte Talks, She Says, The List, Amplifier, Southbound, and FAQ City. Learn more about WFAE and our latest podcast, Work It, at WFAE.org.
All right. So welcome everybody to the Charlotte Podcast Festival for, as we mentioned, Wednesday, October 28th. We're very, very happy that you are here to join us. My name is Brian Baltashevitz. I'm with the Queen City Podcast Network, and this is the Charlotte Podcast Festival. Charlotte's first podcast festival presented by WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the Queen City Podcast Network, Blumenthal Performing Arts, and Eclecs Creative Agency. This session, as we mentioned, just what do all these numbers mean? We're going to dive into the statistics. What's the difference between a subscription and a download, and how to make sense of all those numbers. We're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But first, I want to encourage you, as always, leave your questions in the chat room. We will get to your questions kind of as they come in and as they fit into the conversation tonight. Please do leave your microphones muted. Please leave your microphones on mute, as there are now, let's see, 61 people in the room, and if you all have your mics on at the same time, it's like doing a presentation in a chicken coop, so we don't want that. This session, of course, will be recorded and made available over email later this month, which means towards the end of the week. Make sure at the end of the week that you check your email, including your spam, junk, and promotions folders, to receive this session recording and any other session that you registered for the previous 120 days of this festival. We encourage you to check out the full list of sessions at the Charlotte Podcast Festival website. Just a handful left. CharlottePodcastFestival.com is the site. And of course, if you're sharing the sessions on social media, please use the hashtag CLTPodcastFest. CLTPodcastFest is the hashtag. Now, you've probably noticed the massive amount of money you paid to take in these sessions. Exactly zero. No cost for any of the sessions in the month of October. If you like what you've seen, if you've gotten some information out of it, and you want to say thanks, you can do that by purchasing a spiffy brand new Charlotte Podcast Festival t-shirt from the website at charlottepodcastfestival.com. T-shirts are made right here in Charlotte, and they're really, really cool and really soft, and they've got that really cool kind of fluorescent green logo on it. It's pretty awesome. So charlottepodcastfestival.com is the website. With all of that business out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the Charlotte's own queen of podcasting from WFAE. She's making a face. From WFAE, really the person who's done 99.9% of the heavy lifting in this festival, and even got married this month in the middle of a podcast festival, and is even launching a brand new podcast this week. I don't know when she sleeps. She's here. She's my friend. She is Joni Deutsch. She is going to kind of take you through what all these statistics and numbers mean. So Joni, the room is yours.
Oh gosh, hi. I do sleep. Only a few hours last night, but I blame my dog for barking, which you may hear in the next hour. He's a sheepdog. So with that introduction to my sheepdog, hello everyone. Happy Wednesday. I'm Joni. Happy to be here with you all. Happy to share some insider knowledge about podcast downloads, what that term even means, and what you should know when you're trying to measure your success as a podcast. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to have a presentation to share in just a moment, and you should see it now on your screen. So I'm going to share this presentation. It's probably going to be about 20-30 minutes, and then we're going to use the rest of the time tonight for Brian to share his thoughts as the founder and executive producer of the Queen City Podcast Network, for me sharing my thoughts as someone who's worked with WFAE and NPR podcasting. So by all means, as Brian mentioned, any questions you have, feel free to put them in the comments. No, I don't want to share it. What am I doing? Present. That's what I want to click. But feel free to put your comments in the Zoom chat, and then we'll get around to them sometime during the hour. So today, what we're going to do, We're going to share the difference between all of these different terms that you've probably heard in a variety of ways in a variety of places. Terms including downloads, streams, and we're also going to share considerations for interpreting those podcast stats because there's so many ways to use this information. You could use it for content creation purposes to know what you're doing well with, what you should pivot towards or against, sponsorship potential as you approach individuals for potential ad revenue. There's so many ways to use the data. And of course, the third thing is that this is a resource. We're going to share this with you. So you'll have the PowerPoint slides and you'll also have a recording of tonight's presentation that you will be able to keep and rewatch. So all sorts of fun times with information and data. Woo! All right, so with that said, let's start at the very top. What are podcast analytics? Why should we even care? Well, I'm going to preface this by saying you don't technically need to care. You don't. At the end of the day, if you just want to make a podcast because you want to share your story and perspective and voice with the world, or that of your family and friends and community, you don't necessarily need to care about stats at all. But for those in the room tonight that are interested in wanting to progress their podcasting, whether you want to achieve goals with downloads, with audience growth, with advertisements or sponsorships or grants or whatever the case may be, if you're looking at podcasting as more than just a passion project or hobby, then this is why you should care about podcast analytics. Analytics are an important tool for measuring the success of a podcast and whether the episode, the topic, the guest of your podcast connects with the target audience. Podcast analytics can range from quantitative or numerical data, like unique downloads and subscriber numbers, to qualitative or characteristic data, like where your audience lives, how old they are, what kind of device they listen to your podcast on, not to mention ratings and reviews, and also comments that they leave about your podcast on social media. So lots of different ways to get podcast metrics and data on how successful, quote unquote, you're being. But all that to say is that by tracking analytics, by keeping in touch with the data, you can pinpoint which episodes, which seasons have the highest downloads, listener completion rates, audience engagement. And that can help you streamline future episodes. So you know that you can focus more time on something else rather than putting your time and resources everywhere. And in turn, this information will help you strengthen your podcast strategy and also in the long run, save you time and money and headaches as you continue podcasting. So that's why we care about data. But you don't have to be a data nerd. You can. Freedom of choice. You're welcome to do what you like. So where can you find podcast listener data? So the funny thing is that podcasts exist across different platforms and websites, and there's no standardization. There's no true standardization across places to get consistent data. Unlike television or radio or movies or other kind of media that have been around for decades, maybe even centuries, podcasting is still relatively new. It's only been around for just a couple decades. So kind of hard for it to be consistent when the industry is changing so rapidly with digital media. With that said, if you want a basic idea of how well your podcast is doing, if you want to see the listener data, there are a few places you can check. You can check your podcast host. When I say podcast host, I don't mean a person like Joni's the host of a podcast. What I mean is your place that you are taking your podcast audio to that's distributing it to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the list of apps. So a podcast host could be Anchor, Libsyn, Simplecast, you name it. So log into your podcast host. You should be able to see your podcast listener data there. Or you could log into individual podcast directories. And by that, I mean Apple Podcast, Spotify. I'm going to share with you a little later on what to do if you don't know how to get into those individual podcast directories to see that individual data based on each app. And as I mentioned before, since there is no true consistent way across apps, across devices, across podcasts to see all data consistently, measured consistently, there are several ways to refer to podcast data. For instance, you may call my shirt that I'm wearing gray. Another person could say heather gray. Another person could say black. Another person could say medium gray. They're all kind of the same in different ways, but we used to use different terminology to describe it. The same thing holds true with describing or naming podcast data. We're going to get into that in just a second. And before we get started into the data, I just want to share this. We're all here from different places with different podcasts, with different goals, with different successes and measurements of that. We're living in a world of YouTube videos and views, Instagram followers, and Joe Rogan or the daily downloads, which measure, hundreds of thousands, millions, billions. It's hard to look at them and then want the same for us. Sometimes we have imposter syndrome. Sometimes we feel like we need to be in the same place as those successful entities. But I want you to remember that all podcasts are different in topic and target audience, measurements of success, and audience engagement. Sure, use it for inspiration. Look to your award-winning, multi-million download podcast as inspiration that you love listening to. But try not to feel like you need to replicate that amount of success for yourself. Comparing your podcast to another is like comparing apples to oranges. You measure success on your own terms. So podcast metrics. This is a few ways that you can look to podcast metrics for information and insight. And I'm just giving you a small list. It's not comprehensive, but just to get us started. Downloads, which are the same, but also not the same as plays, streams, and listens. Unique listeners or users, subscribers, listener completion rate, demographic information of your audience, like age, location, how they listen, on what app and where, ratings and reviews for your podcast, social media engagement, comments, likes, shares on social media like Facebook, Twitter, and the like, website visits. Those are all metrics that can relate to your podcast. And we're going to go into a couple of them. So the big question, the title even of today's session, what is a download? What does that even mean? And how is it different from a play/stream/listen? Because again, all these different apps refer to this in a different way or have a different definition to how they look at it. So even if someone has downloaded a file, a podcast episode, your podcast episode, they can take it offline technically, which means that it's kind of impossible to know if the person listened to it right then, if they listened to it at a later date, or if they listen to it at all. So that's why sometimes metrics and downloads or the terminology can be a little misleading, because someone could say that they have 1 million downloads of a podcast, but that might not be a true indication of people listening or how much people listen. It's a blanket statement. A 2018 UK survey found that 32% of respondents in that survey listened to half of their downloaded episodes. So in this example, and you've probably been there, done that, let's say you are a fan of How I Met Your Mother and you have all the episodes downloaded or available on your TiVo, right? Do you watch all of them, or are some of them languishing there, some of them lingering there? Same thing with your podcast feed. Do you have 20 episodes of a podcast and you haven't listened to any of them, but they're just on your device? That's what I'm referring to as downloads, but they're technically not an indication of a successful podcast. A play, stream, listen, on the other hand, can reveal active listening data. It can actually show you how much a person has listened through your episode. And even if they've skipped certain parts of the episode, like your mid-roll advertisement, or if they've stopped listening entirely and skipped to another podcast. So that's a difference. When you're talking about downloads or plays or streams or listens, that's kind of the main difference, is that a download in terminology doesn't necessarily show you the full picture. And again, podcast apps and hosts measure downloads and streams differently. So I just want you all to consider this data point as a start to your investigation of what's working well or not with your content. It's not an absolute conclusion. So you may be wondering, okay, but seriously, I'm here for a reason. How many downloads equate to a successful podcast? Well, industry data right now shows that the average podcast gets approximately 140 downloads in the first 30 days. Again, the average podcast gets approximately 140 downloads in the first 30 days. So if you're wanting to measure your success based off this and this alone, this slide alone, then here's what you should know. Within 30 days of your podcast episode release, if your new episode gets more than 130 downloads, you're in the top 50% of podcasts. That's not to say that's a low barrier, but you can get that, right? More than 130, you're in the top 50% of all podcasts. If you get more than 1,100 downloads, you're in the top 20%. 3,200 downloads, top 10%. 7,700, you're in the top 5%. And then if you get either more than 20,000 or 36,000, you're in the top 2 or 1% respectively. That's all it takes. It's not 1 million downloads to get in the top 1% of podcasts. It's about 36,000 downloads to get in the top 1% if you get in the first 30 days. So again, this presentation will be made available and the recording will be. So if you have any questions, don't worry, you'll have it at the end of the week. So other things I want to get into. What is a unique user / listener? This is important data. Unique users / listeners represent the number of individual people who download or stream your podcast. So to put it in context, your podcast could have 100 downloads, but are all of those 100 download streams coming from a single person who continues to listen and listen and listen and listen and listen? I mean, it could, but if you know the unique users or listeners, the breakdown of that information, it can tell you, oh, well, we have this many users listening this many times. So it's useful in understanding your audience engagement. For example, if your episode has twice the downloads or streams than unique users, listeners, then perhaps your audience enjoyed the content enough to listen twice. So maybe you should consider a similar topic or guest for another episode in the future. Another word that can be used in podcast data and analytics is a subscriber. It's probably one of the more common ones that people use when describing their podcast in terms of success. You know, you'll probably hear someone say, well, I have 1 million downloads and I have 500,000 subscribers. Well, again, similar to downloads, it seems like a big term and a cool term to use, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing well. A subscriber is someone who signs up to receive automatic updates for each new episode. But let me put it in perspective. Similar to email subscriptions, which we all probably have, how many times do you actually open an email in your email inbox? Maybe from Macy's, maybe from a news service. Do you always open up those emails that you subscribe to? Probably not. So that's why a subscriber as a term may not be a true indication of success. With that said, some would consider subscribers to be your most active, loyal supporters because they are wanting, hopefully, they're wanting to see your episodes as soon as they're available. That's the whole point of subscriptions. So take subscriptions and subscribers with a grain of salt. If it's a good enough number in your mind to share, feel free to share it. But just know internally that doesn't necessarily mean that a subscriber is 1-for-1 with a unique listener / downloader. Listener completion rate. This is the one that I highly recommend using when it comes to determining what's working or what's not working with your podcast and the success of the content. Listener completion rate measures the percentage of time a listener is giving to the podcast. And this data usually comes in the form of a chart that's able to tell you, okay, if we're looking at your podcast, we can see that 70% completion rate, where 70% of listeners are getting through the episode. At a certain point, they're dropping out. They're leaving the episode, probably closer to the credits of your episode. It's pretty rare to get a 100% listener completion rate because let's be honest, if you're even watching a movie, are you going to stay until the very end where the credits are, even after the credits? Unless it's a Marvel film, in which case you should because they have great post-credit scenes. But realistically, a completion rate of 60, 70, 80%, that's really good. So this data can help podcasters determine what kind of content engages listeners so that they listen more than just a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes. And you can use this data to then determine, well, should you make a shorter episode to be able to encourage a higher completion rate? Do you need to change the topic? Do you need to change the way that you're talking in the advertisement or mid-roll or pre-roll, post-roll? And again, determine if people are skipping out or leaving entirely. For reference, a recent Edison research survey found that 52% of podcast subscribers listen to entire episodes. 52% of podcast subscribers listen to the entirety of it. That's half. And around 26% of podcast listeners increase the speed of the podcast so they can listen to it entirely. So they're basically cutting down on the time because they're making everything go quicker. So again, indication that maybe make shorter episodes to be able to encourage a higher listener completion rate. And again, you can find all this data, whether you are using a podcast host like Libsyn, Anchor, Simplecast, example, et cetera, or if you want to set up log into accounts on podcast directories, including Spotify for podcasters, Apple Podcast Connect, Stitcher, you name it. And that is free. For podcast directories, for you to log into that and get that information, that is free to do that. Podcast hosts, some of them are free. I mean, you probably are hosting your podcast on one, It may cost a little bit of money each month to host it there. Usually the ones that cost a little bit more get you great data. The ones that are usually free may not get you the best data, but so be it. You can also use free services or third-party services, PodTrack, PodKite, Chartable, Trackable, that can also help you in measuring data. So I want to wrap up this presentation in just a few minutes, but I also want to just remind you a few things. Numbers, podcast data, the number of downloads you have, the number of subscribers you have, it doesn't mean much if your audience is not engaged. For those of you who have been attending our sessions over this month, we've talked about audience so many times. You're knowing who your target audience is, so you can target your marketing and content to them and what they need from you. Knowing who your target audience is so that you can understand how to engage with them, what is going to make them tick and come back to you so that it feels like a community. They feel like they're valued and they're finding something in your podcast that's going to connect with them. The power of your listeners comes from how much they buy into you and how attached they are to your show. The passion is what means people will subscribe to listen to every episode, turn up to your live events, support your advertisers to make sure you stay on the air. Not to mention leaving you ratings and reviews, following you on social media, signing up for your email newsletter, you name it. So my advice to you is to make sure that your audience is engaged, you're in tune with them. You understand what they like about your podcast and what maybe they don't like. Encourage ratings and reviews, and you can actually track them. You don't have to go to individual apps to see it. There's one-stop shops that can tell you all the ratings and all the reviews you've received on all the different apps. You can check out My Podcast Reviews, that's all one word, or Pod Rover for that. And you can also track social media engagement with your accounts. You can use Clamor, that's C-L-M-M-R, or Podable. So again, considerations for connecting with your audience to making sure that they're listening to you longer, that they're listening to you throughout your season or throughout many episodes. Encourage podcast ratings and reviews. Encourage them to email comments and questions and stories to you. Encourage them to leave a social media comment or to provide a voice memo or Google voicemail so you have their voice. All of that can be used by you in the podcast so that they continue listening to hear themselves. Maybe you give them a shout out on a future episode. Maybe you are able to bring them in as a special guest or someone who reads a liner or a promo for you. Ways that they can be brought into the production and in cool ways where they feel like they're included. Of course, you can do other things to connect with your audience to encourage them to continue listening and following you. I put them all in the slide here, but again, embedding a form into your website that they can fill out, doing a virtual or live event, swag giveaways. If they can leave a rating or review, you enter their name into a swag giveaway. Listener feedback survey. Ask your listeners, whether it's a form that you put on your website or including it in your podcast liner notes, a link to it. Ask them, what do they enjoy listening to on your podcast? How often do they listen? Where do they listen? Do they listen to the entire episode? Do they only listen to the first few minutes? That anecdotal data can also help you determine what's working well and what's not, so you can get better numbers if you really care about that. And then considerations, because I know some folks here are probably asking the question, well, okay, I've heard these rumors about how I can get featured in a podcast app. So here's basic knowledge, not to say it's foolproof, but here's some basic knowledge about potential ways to get featured in a podcast app. You need to build an audience leading up to the podcast launch, and then activate them when you have an episode up or a trailer up or a new episode is coming up, so that they can immediately go to the app, listen, download it, stream it, and maybe even subscribe or rate and review it in that podcast app. Make sure you consistently upload episodes. When you consistently upload episodes, it's giving an indication to the audience that, oh, you're going to be there. So the audience can continue to follow you. Other than, if you don't, then they're going to lose interest and forget about you because you're so inconsistent. So being featured in a podcast app, you don't have to have 1 million downloads to do that. You don't have to have 100 downloads in the first hour. I would just say in the first month, of the first 30 days, an episode goes up, just activate your audience. Tell them to go find your podcast in that app, go listen to it, listen to as much of it as possible, and leave ratings and reviews and share about it. And that should do the trick. It's in that first 30 days that you can really make a difference in getting potentially up on a chart or featured. So final thoughts and tips before we go to the Q&A. And again, any questions you have about any information presented or questions for Brian or myself, feel free to put in the comments. The final thoughts, don't get caught up in the numbers. I mean, sure, if you'd like to, you're welcome to, but it's going to drive you insane. Brian and I can attest to this. Numbers, downloads, subscribers can drive you insane. Don't check on a daily basis. It's like the stock market. If you can check on the daily basis, sure, you can, but do you want to? Is that going to really show you an indication? Maybe wait a week, maybe wait 2 weeks, maybe wait at the end of the month to see how your podcast download is doing. And again, there's so many ways to define podcast success. Your goals can continue to change and grow as your podcast grows. It takes time to build a community. It takes time to build an audience. We've talked about this greatly over the course of the last month over different sessions. So just know that Rome wasn't built in a day. Your community will come to you so long as you're being authentic and you're putting time and honesty in your production. And celebrate your success. If you are getting 100 downloads and that was your goal to get 100 downloads, celebrate it. Keep track of it. If you get sweet comments from listeners and that's how you're measuring your success, create a Google Doc and screenshot all those comments or copy them over and keep a record of it. So on a rainy day, if you feel bad, go back to the Google Doc and see how people really appreciate what you're doing through podcast. And just know, again, you measure your success and your success is going to look different from the people in Hollywood making podcasts, the people in New York making podcasts, the people on this call making podcasts. So you've got this. Brian, I think I talked everyone's ears off, so I will shut up.
Really, really good stuff, Joni. Thanks for putting that together. Couple questions just for some clarification. What is it, TiVo?
Oh, TiVo. Oh, TiVo is.
No,
oh, okay.
I'm kidding.
I was like, I earnestly was going to answer the question.
No, I know you were. It was the first DVR, is what.
Yeah.
Is what a TiVo. That was, I believe, that was Kale being sarcastic.
Thank you, Kale. Kale is one of the moderators of the festival. Thank you, Kale.
But seriously, though, a couple clarification questions from Stefan. A subscriber is an RSS download and a download listen is an MP3 download, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So basically the same thing. A download's a download. The RSS feed links directly to your MP3 file. So when you get your RSS feed, right, like Apple Podcasts doesn't store all 1.2 million podcasts on their own servers. They link to your RSS feed, and everybody who links to that RSS feed just goes and grabs that specific file. So that's how they can keep track of how many people listen to your podcast, because it's all based on that one file.
Yep, what Brian said.
Let's see, there was another question. Okay, so you used subscribers and listeners at one point. Joni, do they mean the same thing?
No, they don't. I mean, if you want to be technical, a subscriber is just like an email subscription. You could subscribe to an email, but you're not reading the emails all the time. You could just be getting a lot of emails in your inbox, but not opening them. So in a technical sense, you are a subscriber, but are you a reader of the emails? So a subscriber is different from a listener. It's like a rectangle and square. It can be both, or it could be either. So I think that's, again, the difference in the presentation I shared is that you have something called a unique listener or a unique streamer, a unique individual user, a unique user who shows that they are listening to it, versus a subscriber, which all the press and all the industry outside of podcasting, they think subscriber is a huge word, is like a big, cool term. But technically, we know that a subscriber could mean nothing. It could be empty calories. if you will. So yeah, there could be a difference between a subscriber and a unique listener or a unique user who's actually listening to the podcast, or it could be one and the same, depending.
Right, and by the same token, the download might not be a listen either. I have some podcasts that download directly to my phone automatically that I never ever get to listen to,
Exactly.
and then I don't even realize I have them until I run out of memory on my phone because I have a billion podcast episodes on my phone.
Exactly.
So they're not all equal. Tricia, can I make a page of my organization's website or a podcast page where people can listen with links to subscribe via Apple? So if you have a page and you embed your host's podcast player onto your website page, you're literally just embedding that same RSS feed that we just talked about, the same thing that Apple Podcasts references, the same thing Stitcher will reference, that RSS feed. So it's still that same file, right? So anyone who even if they go to your podcast page or your organization's page and they click on play in that player that's embedded on your page, that will still register as a play or as a listen in your statistics, because it's literally accessing the same file. So yeah, so anything, whether it's embedded on a page or whether you get it through a podcast aggregator, it's all the same thing. A listen's a listen because it's all accessing the same file.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. So Terry Page asked, and not really a crazy question, Terry, but how long is a season in the podcast world? So not really a statistics related question, but certainly, Joni, something that people want to know. How long is a season? Is 2 episodes a season?
Ooh, interesting question. Again, it's one of the, I hate to be the person that's like, a season could be whatever you want, just like podcasting, but it is. There's no definite length to what a season or series is. So a season could be 3 episodes. A season could be 26 episodes. It could be more, it could be less. Some podcasts, technically it's a forever season because they make it continuously, like The Daily from the New York Times or Up First from NPR. It's not a season, it's a daily podcast in perpetuity. So I guess, again, it's one of those things that you decide. Do you want to tell people that your season is going to be 10 episodes, or that your season is going to be a season launching on November 12th, but you don't have a number of episodes in mind? You're just going to say the first season or a season of your podcast is available.
Yeah, Joni, WFAE produced the She Says podcast that was, I believe, 9 episodes first, and then you released kind of a 10 to sort of up a 10th episode, to kind of update the thing. But that She Says podcast tells one story through the whole the series at 9 or 10 episodes. That may be the end of that particular podcast, right?
Yeah, and for those who don't know, She Says was an investigative podcast about an assault that took place here in the Charlotte area. So originally we had a certain number of episodes in mind, but we never revealed that to the audience because we weren't sure. It was an active investigation taking place as we were reporting on it. So similar to In the Dark, which has won so many awards, Peabody Awards. In fact, it was able to get a Supreme Court to come in and be able to make the person, able to get out of jail and prison. That podcast started basically 2-3 years ago, I think, that season. And they just released their final episode because technically the case is over. So don't feel like you have to put your back against a wall and tell people, okay, I promise it's only 2 episodes for a season or 20 episodes. You can leave it open. I just relay that, though, in some small way to say our first season launches on this date, and we hope that you stay subscribed as we go throughout the season. Keep it kind of open-ended.
It's Joni, a question from Petra asking, how long were those podcasts in that Edison research? And you suggested maybe using that research to look at your length if you find that listeners aren't staying with your podcast until the end of the total runtime.
Yeah, so let me share a little bit more information that can help with length. What we have found as a public radio station, what other major entities have found with their podcast listenership, and again, this is not to say this is resolute, and it applies to everyone everywhere. But some common trends we found is that the longer the episodes, if it's longer than 30 minutes, and if it's not really a sound-rich podcast, and by that I mean it's simply an interview podcast, a chat cast, a roundtable discussion. It's not a serial production with like documentary style audio and sound design. If it's simply an interview podcast and it's over 30 minutes, people may not sit and listen to the entirety of it. That's why it's important for you to know who your target audience is and how much time they have to devote to your podcast and where they're listening, how they're listening. Before the pandemic, a lot of people listened to on their commutes. Commutes have changed during the pandemic. So if you know then what time people have available in their day-to-day to listen, then you can cater your podcast length to that. But the rule of thumb is that 30 minutes or less is a really good starting point for a podcast to be able to get people to listen to the majority of it. Again, that's not absolute 30 minutes right on the dot, just a ballpark estimate. What I would say for listener completion rates is look at your data over the course of a month or a couple months. If you're seeing that your listener completion rate is 40%, 50%, 60%, try this. Try decreasing the length. Try shortening the length of your podcast episode by a few minutes, by 10 minutes, maybe in half, and then measure that for another month and see if your listener completion rate increases to 70%, to 80%. My guess is that it probably will. But it's one of those things. Once you have kind of a baseline of what your listeners are liking or not liking through the data, anecdotally or quantitatively, then you can make some changes. You can pivot in your productions a bit and measure that for a bit and then see positive result, negative result, no result, and you try a different pivot.
Excellent answer, Johnny. That's great stuff. Hey, so question about which of these metrics that are available to us in the deep sea of metrics that we have access to, which of those metrics might matter the most if you're pitching your podcast to a potential sponsor?
So honestly, if your sponsor has no idea what a podcast is, and I mean in the sense of like they know what a podcast is because they listen to one, but they don't really know what a podcast is in terms of like the technical data I just shared with you and the terminology, then they probably will only be interested in how many downloads you have and how many subscribers you have, maybe how many unique users or listeners you have, but that's it. And that's fine. We had an excellent panel that Brian here actually moderated on Monday with Stacy Sims about sponsorships and how, you know, a sponsor, when you make this agreement with a sponsor, you tell them, I'm providing this data to you on a consistent basis or not at all. I mean, you decide. If you want to share with them on a monthly basis, here's the downloads over the month, or here's the listen completion rates for the month, you can do that. But Stacy shared on Monday's call, which we'll make available at the end of this week for you all to watch, sometimes advertisers don't care and they don't ask and they don't think to ask. So you don't need to give them the data. So I would say if you want to give them something that they feel like they need to know because the industry makes it popular, like being on the New York Times bestseller list when it's actually kind of a hoax, then give them downloads, give them subscribers, give them listeners. Technically, they should care about listener completion rates if they're really doing their job well, because listener completion rates will share if you have a pre-roll advertisement in the very beginning of the podcast, or a mid-roll in the middle part, or at the very, very end, the post-roll. That's where the money is. So if your listener completion rate shows that your ad at the beginning, in the middle, and the end, if listeners are listening through 70% of the podcast, that means they're only hearing probably the first two messages, not the end credits one. And that should matter to your advertiser. But yet again, your advertiser probably doesn't know this terminology, and so they're not going to ask. That's not to say you need to offer it. It's like you kind of saying, like, I have the answers to the test. Do you want it too, teacher? You decide.
Yeah, your advertisers are going to want to know, obviously who's listening, where they're located, are they listening to the whole show, and things like that. So those are statistics too that, remember, you can't you can't give them those kinds of numbers if you haven't necessarily released
So
your
true.
podcast episode yet, right?
So
So
true.
we get that question a lot, like, hey, I'm thinking about launching this podcast. I'm going to create this thing. It's going to be really good. I'm kind of started to work on it. How can I get sponsorships? Well, you've got the cart firmly planted before the horse there. You've got to have something to sell, and you can't sell anything to a potential advertiser because the advertiser isn't interested in your podcast. They're interested in who's listening to your podcast.
Yep. And sometimes they're interested in the mission of it or the idea of it. Maybe aligns well with their target audience and the interest of their target audience, or the topic that they address, or the products they make as a company. I want to, this is not about sponsorships. It's not the point of the call, but it's tangentially related. So I'll share this. Something I always tell podcasters is that you don't need to have data in order to bring it to a sponsor to get a sponsor. You don't need to have an episode up. You don't need to have 20 episodes up. Technically you don't. You can sell an idea without any of that data. But what you should do, though, is have a pitch deck. You should have a strategy and be able to share that in a coherent way, in a passionate way with your potential sponsor, so that they know where you're coming from, that you're going to deliver on an idea, and that idea is amazing and it ties directly to that company, their mission, their target audience. So that's just another consideration for you all, is that, yes, having data like that, having demographic data on who your pre-existing downloads and listeners and subscribers are, you can get that from your podcast host. You can get that from the podcast directories I mentioned a bit ago. But if you don't have any of that, if you haven't even launched yet and you're freaking out like, oh, I want to sponsor, but I don't have data, you can still sell an idea without the data, without the downloads. And I tell you that as someone who has done that. And we've been able to get a 5-figure deal on a podcast because we simply brought in an idea and executed it well with graphics, with a radio promo to give them a teaser of what it sounded like. I even tagged it at the end. We brought it physically to the sponsor, Ortho Carolina, which is also a sponsor of the Queen City Podcast Network, Brian's organization. And we brought the audio to them as a teaser of what the episode would be like months later. And I tagged at the end saying, support for Amplifier is provided by Ortho Carolina. So they could literally hear what their sponsorship would sound like. And that makes a difference.
Yeah, and one thing also to remember, if you're approaching potential sponsors, particularly potential sponsors who maybe normally advertise in broadcast and radio or television, they're going to expect to see some numbers, and they're going to expect to see some very specific things. So remember, the statistics, while it's easy to get lost in them, the statistics can be very important if you are going to pursue any sort of sponsorship.
Yeah, and I'll just add too quickly, Brian, that Clark and Terry, your comments about advertisers care about the type of listeners, absolutely. Yes. So demographic information, if that's something that they are saying, we need to know the majority of your listeners, where they're coming from as the downloads happen. Again, it's to your discretion. If you want to say, yes, I can provide this information to you, when I can provide it to you, you decide that. If it's simply the downloads, the subscribers, whatever the case may be, you decide. You're in control of your data, not the advertiser.
Yeah. Bit of question about the data of what platforms listeners are using to listen to your podcast, and if that has any impact on the general statistics.
Yes, it is. So I actually, if I can quickly find it, give me 1 second, because as I was doing this presentation, I was going into a deep dive of the difference between downloads and streams, and an agency called Pacific Coast. Let me see if I can find it real quick, and I'll put it in the chat. They did an analysis of the difference between podcast downloads and streams, and how different apps, different podcast directories like Apple or Spotify or you name it, how they have, actually I think it was Simplecast, how they actually do their downloads differently, how they approach it all differently. So here we go. I found it. It was Simplecast. I was right. So I'm putting the link in the chat, and you're more than welcome to check it out. But basically, you can see on this analysis of popular podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, Stitcher, Overcast, that the apps are made in different ways and they rate downloads and streams in different ways, or they encourage downloads and streams in different ways. Some of them automatically download the podcast to your app versus they allow you to stream it. So that just goes back to my presentation tonight, that there is no consistent way to measure across all the different apps in the world and all the different services, all the different podcast hosts. So that's just a fun little fact about podcasting, is that it's the Wild West and we're trying to make sense of it and untangle it. So there's no absolute. That's the biggest thing I hope you take away from this. It's crazy, but there's no absolute to what is a download, or how many downloads I'm getting, because there's so many variables involved. And for instance, your IP address, depending on what device you're using or when you're in the household or when you're out of the household, it could show up as 3 different downloads or 3 different streams because you're in and out of your IP address, which is associated with you listening to that piece of audio. So technically, it could be that it shows up to the podcast person that you're 3 people, but you're not. You're 1 person. Again, it's the little things that make you go crazy, which is why I'd say information can provide insight, but it shouldn't be an absolute indicator of where you should be going next. Use it as inspiration.
Yeah, we quick anecdote. We had the ability when I was working in broadcast television and the TiVos started coming out. We had the ability to, we were getting data from the manufacturers of these DVRs, and because they're hooked up to the internet, they can tell when people pause on images, when they fast forward through commercials, what they're actually watching, what they go back and watch. So there's all kinds of really in the weeds statistics that you have access to. And I was working at I'm a TV station, and I was running the marketing for the 11 o'clock newscast for this television station. And we had all this data and charts and things like that of when people were watching, when they were flipping off of us, what they were flipping off to,
Yep.
where they were coming to us from, all kinds of different data. And the problem when you have access to too much data is that you can make some knee-jerk reactions based on tiny little movements in the data. The people in the industry have literally lost jobs because they were the person on TV when a handful of people turn the TV off, and the assumption for broadcast management is that, they don't like that person, that's why people are tuning them off. So all of a sudden that person is gone, right? So we ended up completely restructuring the 11 o'clock news format because we were about 4 minutes into the newscast, people were kind of starting to tune out, but the numbers were so limited that it's entirely possible it was because the one person who was watching had to go to the bathroom and maybe turn the TV off and then went to the bed. So like literally, what if you get too much into the weeds with these numbers, you can read too much. And that's why kind of Joni and I both say, just be careful with the numbers. I have a client who texts me every 2 hours asking about the numbers for their podcast. That's kind of obsessive. Don't be that person. It's okay to pay attention to your numbers and have an idea, have a sense of who's listening and where they're listening from and things like that. But don't be so hung up on the numbers that you become obsessed with them. You're checking your data, every 30 seconds just to watch the numbers move on the graph. It will literally drive you crazy. So just don't be that person.
Absolutely. And I hope that if anything's taken away from tonight, it's that, 1, there's tons of words and terms related to podcast stats, and they're all nonsensical in some way. 2, that you should not get caught up in the numbers. I hope that I reiterated that in the presentation. Podcast numbers can be interesting and insightful, but they shouldn't control your life. And 3, you define your own success and your goals. So yes, you're wanting to do the best you can. It's why you're here tonight. You want to learn, you want to grow as a podcaster. But just know that we're all human, and it takes time to grow things. It takes time to grow flowers. It takes time to grow a podcast audience. And you just need to keep that in mind, that it's not a sprint. So take successes whenever you see them. And even if that's simply a nice email you receive one time over the course of a month, that's something to be proud of.
Joni, when people ask you, well, how many people listen, like non-sponsorships, just like general people, well, how many people listen to your podcast? Or how do you answer that question?
I mean, you can tell them any kind of thing. You can tell them the average number of downloads that you get. You can tell them what the total downloads in a month you get. You can tell them, I mean, I think it's a little nerdy if you're like, well, I get 76% completion rates on my podcast. I wouldn't do that. I mean, you can, it's up to you. But I mean, I guess it just depends. Like, is it just a family member? Do they even know what a podcast is? You just want to tell them a number and they can say, okay, dear, good job. Do you want some pot roast? But again, I'd say maybe average downloads, that's just kind of standard. A lot of folks in this podcast festival are happy to share what their average downloads are. Total downloads, if you've gone over a certain threshold of downloads, say you've had more than 1 million downloads over the course of your 10 years as a podcaster, you could tell them whatever data you want, or you can tell them, hey, why don't you listen, and then I'll add that to the list of downloads, and then I'll tell you afterwards.
Yeah, I rarely, if ever, share those numbers with people who ask. It just because it doesn't. What's important is the content, right? It always starts with the content. It starts with what the message is.
Yeah.
I rarely ever share those numbers. However, I am now, after seeing the stats, Joni, in your presentation, I'm going to start telling people that, well, we're in the top 40% of all podcasts on Apple. So
and
you can
that
use
sounds
that
impressive,
number, right?
because that is impressive. But it's like, again, most podcasts don't get a lot of downloads, or most podcasts are done after 5 episodes. We talked about this earlier today with Brian hosting a panel on a pod fade, or I should say yesterday. So, because there's a lot of podcasts out there, it actually doesn't take a lot for you to make a name for yourself if you're looking simply at downloads. But yeah, go ahead, use that data in this presentation, find where you are in the downloads per month and say, oh yeah, I'm in the top 10%. And that's really impressive, because people don't really know that out there. They know that here because y'all are part of the presentation. They don't know that out there. Use that to your advantage.
Yeah. Joni, where can folks find you on the social medias?
On the social medias, you can find me at A Change of Tune. That's A Change of Tune, which is my very first public radio show that I produced in West Virginia, my home state. So you can find me there. And also find me at Joni Deutsch on LinkedIn, and all the fun places. There's not really a lot of Joni Deutsches out there, so it's pretty easy to find me on social media.
I can guarantee you, Joni, there's only one.
Oh, one that matters. I'm kidding. No, there's another Joni out there that matters. Her name's Joni Mitchell, but otherwise Joni Deutsch is pretty rare.
I accept that. So Joni, thanks a lot for your insight and your expertise. And as I mentioned before, you've done the bulk of the heavy lifting on this entire month for the podcast festival. So thank you so much for everything that you've done to get this stuff done.
Happy to, and thanks all for attending, and thank you to Brian for moderating and also being a part of the process. I mean, it takes a team to bring all this audio together in so many different ways. So Brian, I guess I didn't get to ask you any questions. Let me ask you.
Sure.
What advice would you give to folks out there that are thinking about downloads, and they're thinking about subscribers, and they want to build an audience right quick?
The best way to build an audience, like I said a couple seconds ago, it all starts with the content, right? If you build good content, if you're passionate about it, other people will be passionate about it as well. So focus on the content first. And then trust that the numbers will come, but don't expect to get huge numbers right out of the gate. Don't expect to be in the top 50% right out of the gate. Podcasting, for those of us who aren't, Joe Rogan or How I Built This, podcasting is a bit of a slow play. So don't be frustrated right out of the gate. Continue to create good content, and people will find you.
I absolutely agree. And I think at the end of the day, you just need to figure out what your goals are. And if it's simply to make content that you're happy with, that's all you can do. That's all you need to ask for. Yeah. Feel good stuff. Feel good stuff.
Exactly. And most importantly, just do it. Just if you've been thinking about it, there's no better time than now. The people are they're looking for diversions. They're looking for things to listen to. They're looking for things to listen to. They're looking to hear your voice. So now's the time to get up there and to launch your podcast.
Damn Skippy.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Don't forget, just 2 full days, I guess, left in the festival. Check out the schedule at charlottepodcastfestival.com. Pick up a spiffy new t-shirt if you like what you're hearing here. That also helps support and offset a bit of the cost of putting the festival on. So charlottepodcastfestival.com for the schedule and the t-shirts. Again, if you're talking about us on social media, hashtag CLT Podcast Fest, hashtag CLT Podcast Fest, and you'll get video links for all the sessions that you registered for coming up towards the end of the week.
Brian, you didn't share where people could find you.
Oh, but sure. So I'm at on Twitter. I'm at ncbalto72, and you can also find the Queen City Podcast Network at Queen City PN on Twitter, and Queen City Podcast Network, I want to say, on Instagram and on Facebook as well. And I'm ncbalto72 on Instagram as well. And feel free to find us. Feel free to reach out, ask us questions, even after this thing is over. Joni and I can and have talked about podcasts all day long, so we can
All day long. Podtober. I'm kidding. It is though. It's Podtober.
It is. So thanks, Joni. Thanks, WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, Queen City Podcast Network, Blumenthal Performing Arts, and Eclecs Creative Agency. We appreciate their involvement in putting this whole shooting match together. Joni, the last word belongs to you.
You can do this, everyone. Podcasting, there's an I in podcasting. There's no me, but there's an I, and that's you. And that's it.
That's a t-shirt, is what that is.
No, it's not. Don't humor that idea.
There's no me, but there's an I, and that's you. I kind of like it. I kind of like it. Somebody wrote that down, I hope.
Nope.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. We will see you tomorrow at the Podcast Festival. And don't forget about the happy hour Friday night. Last chance for all of us to sort of get together and mix and mingle as networks. Thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.